We're reading from the first chapter of Habakkuk, which is on page 940, if you've got a Pew Bible. First chapter and just into chapter 2. This is the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you don't save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralysed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if I told you. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honour. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own strength is their God. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you've ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You've made men like fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint.
This is the first in a series of 3 sermons that we'll be looking at on the book of Habakkuk, and I'm very grateful to Simon for kicking us off with Habakkuk 1. Thank you, Simon.
I was supposed to be preaching originally last week. I think was it on power or something I was supposed to be originally doing, which in reflection actually would have been quite difficult to preach on anyway. But we swapped around, and Malcolm emailed me in the week to say, Dawn has read the passage and we've realised it's actually quite difficult. So thank you very much, Malcolm. That's very kind of you. And it's particularly difficult because it goes through some really big issues. Habakkuk has a question, God answers. It's not quite the answer Habakkuk was expecting, so he questions him and said, well, actually, that just gives me even more questions. And then in chapter 2, which is next week from Malcolm, God answers. So I'm doing the bit of the questions up to the bit at which God answers. So it's going to be quite interesting. Now, I don't know how many of us have actually looked at Habakkuk. I was talking to my friend the other day, and neither of us could quite remember exactly what happened in Habakkuk, but he said, is it just, I suppose it's just like one of the prophets. He just does sort of prophet-y things. He talks about God and stuff. And to some extent, he's actually quite right. The prophets, all more or less, have the same kind of concerns. They're worried about the injustices they see around them. And virtually all of them right in times when God has said, actually, I don't really appreciate what's going on in Israel at the moment. I don't really like what I'm seeing. And I personally, I always like to place passages in their historical context. I find that quite interesting. So I'm going to indulge my own historical interest for a second. So you can come back in about 3 minutes if you want. But yeah, so you have to go back really to the time when the Israelites came out of Egypt years and years before with Moses. They made a covenant with God. They made a relationship, an agreement that God would bless them. And he gave them the law as like a guardian, as a way of helping them through their lives, of helping them to live for him and helping them to be prosperous. And for the most part, in the early days at least, they were quite good at following God, although they, even then, like all of us, they made mistakes. They had moments where they thought, oh, is God really there? Let's go and worship something else. Let's do something else. There must be something else to life, and maybe God isn't around. But gradually over time, what happened was they split into two kingdoms. So originally we had Israel, then we had Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So we had our two different kingdoms because basically there were two sons of a king. They both wanted power, so they thought, well, we'll just fight against each other like brothers do. And they did it over an entire kingdom. So they were split in half. And what ended up happening was the Israelites in 712 BC, very important date, they were conquered by the Assyrian Empire. So there was a sense that God said, I really don't like what you're doing. He'd sent loads of prophets. They said, come on, sort yourselves out. And they had a little bit, but no, actually they hadn't really. So they were conquered in 712 BC, but we still had the slightly smaller kingdom in the south. They were still doing okay. And they had some kings that were good, some kings that were bad. And generally, the population of Israel would follow whatever their king believed. So it was quite dependent on if the king said, let's follow God, or no, let's not bother. And some of them were really oppressive kings. But we just had, at the time of Habakkuk, just before Habakkuk writes this, we'd had a great king. We'd had King Josiah, who'd been at a time when they'd rediscovered the book of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, and thought, actually, we really need to follow this. So they'd had a great reform, and things had looked really good until Josiah died, and his son thought, no, not interested again. So they sort of relapsed, and this is around the time of 609 BC. That's when they reckon around about that time that this book was written. And that number, for some reason, really helps me understand it. I don't know why. I think it's just a number. Susie, on the other hand, my wife, who's upstairs, she's completely different to me. If you give her a number, that just confuses the issue. So for some of you, that might be the case. You're thinking it's a little bit irrelevant, but I find it quite useful personally. And the other thing to note is that the Assyrians that had conquered Israel in the first place, they're not really quite so strong anymore because the Babylonians have started going around kicking up a bit of a fuss. And they've just recently defeated the Assyrians at Nineveh, which is the place Jonah went. And also, they've just defeated the Egyptians, who are the other big power. So all of a sudden, Babylon has gone from being like the annoying younger brother to somebody, a bit like my brother, actually. He used to be the annoying younger brother. Now he's a lot stronger than me, which is very, very demoralising. But so they've gone to this stage. They're now in control. Babylon, it's almost feels like a matter of time before they start looking at Judah and thinking, we've not conquered there yet, let's go there. And this is the kind of context that Habakkuk is writing in. He can see all the injustice in his land, and he understands the covenant. But he sees it in quite an interesting way. As I said, he's like the prophets. He's really concerned about what's going on in Israel. But unusually, the book is actually a conversation between him and God. Rather than thinking, well, these people are doing awful things, I'm going to go out and talk to them, he says, these people are doing awful things, God, what are you doing about it? That seems to be the way in which he goes about his job. And you can tell just how worried he is about what's going on. So in verse 2 he says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? And he's going into a particular style of writing here. He's going into a lament. It's almost that he can't express it just by writing it down. He has to use poetry, much like a lot of the psalmists would write, like the psalm we heard, Psalm 73 earlier. There's that kind of really kind of using poetry. I saw a documentary, or a little snippet of it on ballet dancers the other day, bizarrely. And it was only a snippet, just to make that clear, just a snippet. But there was somebody there who was saying, that they could only really express certain things about themselves when they were dancing. For them, that was the way they expressed their creativity, that they couldn't maybe do in words and in actions in normal life. And there's a sense that Habakkuk, he's so annoyed about what's going on, he's so wound up, about what's happening in Israel, that he goes into a classic kind of lament, a kind of poetry. And funnily enough, if you read Lamentations in the Bible, that's quite a good example, as the name would suggest. But what's unusual about him is, I think, if that was me, I would be really annoyed about the injustice, because that would mean potentially I wasn't, getting my due in life. I wasn't getting the things that I should do. That he was worrying about the violence because actually he was under threat as a member of Israel. That actually maybe the rulers that were supposed to be doing this great job of following God and looking after the people, that actually they were oppressing them, and he'd be quite worried about that. But there seems very much a sense with Habakkuk that he's more worried about God. He's more almost concerned that, well, God, these are your people, and you're letting this happen, and actually that's reflecting really badly on God. So he's almost looking at it from that point of view. And he goes on to say, therefore the law is paralysed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. So you can see that he's really, really worried. But what I find really impressive about him, and something I think is really useful for us just to think about, is the fact that he has all these concerns, and he is worried about it from a godly point of view, but he starts with God. The first place he goes to God. The fact he says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, suggests that he has been doing it for quite a while. So he's been crying out to God and saying, and going straight to God with this problem, with these injustices that he sees. Now, wonderfully, God decides to bless him with an answer. Now, the answer is actually to all of Israel. So he says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. And the word you, there, we don't have plural yous in our language, unless you say you lot or yous, but that's not very good grammar, is it? So you wouldn't say that. But in Hebrew that would be fine, and these yous are to all of Israel, so it's a plural thing, it's not just Habakkuk anymore. So everybody's involved. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honour. And you get a sense immediately of just how awful this whole idea is to Habakkuk. He talks about, the fact that they're a law to themselves and they promote their own honour. And it goes on to say that their God is their own strength, that they don't fear God, they don't worship God, they worship themselves, effectively. They worship the fact that they're bigger and stronger, and they can conquer people. And this seems to Habakkuk, as I think probably to many of us while we read it, completely confusing. So what it seems to be saying is God is amazing and he's going to do this awesome thing, and he is going to act, and to act against the injustice that he sees in Israel. But he seems to be doing it in quite a strange way, in that he's using people, as Habakkuk goes on to say, that are more wicked than the people in Israel. So why is he using these people that are really wicked? And actually, if we look back again, as I said, about Assyria, in the Bible it also talks about them as the rod of God's wrath. So he's already done this before with Israel. He's talked about Assyria as almost a tool that he used to punish them. And as we can see at this point, they are no more. They have been punished as well. So it's not a case of God forgetting, but it is very, very strange when you think about it in these terms. And I think often it's quite easy in church to look at the kind of easy issues, the nice issues, and not really engage with these kind of questions, and like the question of Trident and that kind of thing. And I think they're right. There is a lot of grey, and it is quite confusing. So I just need to look at my notes to remember where we're going now. So Habakkuk responds, and it's entitled in the NIV, Habakkuk's Second Complaint. So he's still not quite happy. So I'll read this because it's a really key passage. I'll just read it again to refresh it. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? And again, what I think is absolutely amazing, and the key thing from this text, is that so he's got this massive problem, he doesn't really understand what God is doing, which I imagine it's the same for me personally. Sometimes I don't really understand what God's doing. But what he does is he goes to God and says, and starts off before he really complains, says, why, God, are you doing this? He says, "O Lord, are you not from everlasting, my God, my Holy One?" So he talks in a very personal way about the relationship he has with God. And also he goes straight back to God and says, actually, where else am I going to find these answers? If you want to know what God is doing and why he's doing it, well, surely God is the best place to find those answers. And it seems quite obvious in some ways, but it's so hard to do. I remember when I was at LST, the best piece of advice we had in our first week was, if you have questions about God, then don't let them drive you away from God, but take them to God. Wrestle with those questions with God. And that's something I think is really important. I think it is easy, isn't it, if there's a question where we think, I don't really understand this bit about God. How it can leave you either just sort of leave it and think, well, I'm not going to worry about it then, just ignore it like it's not there, or to actually let it turn you away from God. Whereas what Habakkuk is doing here is he just doesn't really understand God's theology, effectively. But what he does do is say, I'm going to come back to you, God. I trust that you are faithful, that you are everlasting, that you are an amazing God, and then I have this relationship with you. And although I don't understand what you're doing, I'm going to come to you with this question. And he goes on to say, as I said, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. God is such a pure and holy God. How is it that he can even look on sin? That's the problem with Israel at the moment. So how can he use these people? And that's a question I think that he doesn't, in this passage, really completely answer. But he says, despite these questions, I'm still going to trust in God. Yeah, and as I said, so he says, therefore he sacrifices to his net, when he's talking about Babylon, this is, and burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. And if we went back to Psalm 73 again, that we read earlier, there was that sense that, the psalmist, the guy writing it, saying, I can see all these wicked people around me, and they actually seem to have more than I do. So I'm following God, but I've got less. How does that work, God? And again, there's the same sense here. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net, and talking about how the Babylonians, talking about them almost as a person here, that they are sacrificing to the net, that they're worshipping the very thing, their strength again. They're worshipping their own power. But even, I mentioned Lamentations earlier as well. Even when we read that, that's at a time a few years later than this, when actually the Babylonians have come, they have conquered, they have dispersed a lot of the Israelites, they've moved them to different places, which must have been a tremendously hard thing to be uprooted from the culture you knew. And your whole identity is built around the fact that we are God's people, that he's made a covenant with us, that we have his temple, that God will bless us, that God will save us. But actually, hang on, we've just been moved thousands of miles away into Assyria. We're in a foreign land. We don't have the temple. It's been destroyed. Jerusalem, where we thought God, dwelt, where we pray towards, well, actually, that's ruins now, and we're in a complete different place. And in Lamentations, you get that sense when you read it, that there's a complete sense of despair. But even within that, even within the middle of Lamentations, there's that really famous verse, that great is thy faithfulness, is built around that song. And where he says, even though all this stuff is going on, your mercies are new every morning, and great is your faithfulness. And if there's anything that we take away from this, it's that we can have questions about God, that we should question God, that we should go to him with our worries and our concerns, but at the same time trusting that God is a faithful God, that God will be with us, that God is everlasting, and that he cares about us even when it seems that he's not there. And Habakkuk comes to this point at the end. He says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. So he says basically, in effect, I'm just going to wait for God. I'm going to wait for you. I don't understand it. And what Habakkuk does is he comes back to God and starts with God, and he finishes with God as well. He says, okay, so I've asked these questions, I don't understand, but ultimately I'm going to trust that you are God, that you are big enough to answer these questions, that you are big enough to still be God, even if I personally don't understand. That doesn't affect the fact that you are an amazing God. And he ends with God and says that I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. And then we get on to chapter 2, which Malcolm will do next week. And maybe bits that don't make so much sense might do.